regardless of if you expect it or not. You're responsible.
You are responsible.
Yeah.
No, exactly. And I mean, like, having worked in an attorney's office that deals with that kind of thing, like, we have so many cases where, you know, dad decides, you know, I don't want to raise this child, but they also don't want to pay child support. And I'm like,
You don't get one or the other.
no,
like,
I'm sorry, but like,
you're lucky you have a choice.
Your genes, like, your DNA is half of this child, so that's what that is, and you need to support them on some level.
Like, I personally feel so strongly about it. Yeah, I think that, like, mistakes happen, but you gotta
Yeah.
live with those mistakes.
Exactly. I think there's
You need to be responsible. You messed up the first time. Second time is the time to fix it. Now, this paper, I actually felt okay.
Here you are.
I made it. Yeah, I got dismissed.
Good for you. I was dismissed the only time
Have you ever got called?
called E2, and that was because it was an animal abuse case.
Oh gosh, no, yeah, I don't think I could
I'm
do
a
that.
dog lover, so
Yeah.
of course the defense attorney
Didn't want
Couldn't
you on
be
that.
out of the room.
Yeah.
didn't want me on the jury.
I want to be on the
I was
jury.
called. I had jury duty this
I
morning.
wanna be
They
on,
didn't
like,
have
a
any. They didn't need
trial.
anybody, so they just dismissed us all after like making us sit there for like an hour.
I am, like, looking forward to the day when I find jury duty, which is ironic.
It was
It's
actually
like,
kind of fun. Like I was kind of looking forward to it, and like my attorney,
In fact,
like my
you're
boss,
always
my
all the
attorneys
way
were like, "Oh, you'd be the perfect candidate for any trial because you have some legal knowledge, but you're not an attorney yourself." Blah blah blah. And I was like, "All right, I'll probably get picked." You know. So what if I have a midterm tomorrow? That's a whole other problem.
Yeah.
But you know.
I haven't started yet. I haven't had time.
No. Yeah. Do you want to meet
I don't
tonight?
think I'm gonna have time.
Yeah,
because,
that's fine if you don't.
Like, it's so bad where my wonderful girlfriend is so nice.
Want your copy now?
Sure. Oh,
It
that's
doesn't
so
matter.
sweet. Oh.
I can
And then
take
tonight
people's
she's coming over,
papers
and we're just gonna
if they want it. I can take both copies. I'll just put them into the file.
I need to go print.
I know that this worked out the way it did because Professor Sackett wants something to do over spring break.
Who wants one?
Yeah, I'm teaching a class over spring break, so I am not missing things to do, but still, I did give myself this little chore, and Andrea too.
I know. I'm going to. Well, I have a couple of things.
Look at this. Isn't this like mass?
I know.
Now, hi. Yeah, that's fine. In fact, we're not even going to stay that, or we might stay till about 3, but not. I'm going to call class early today because it's the end of the first half. Trying to be friendly. Okay. Once again, welcome to History 3000, Section 2, the history of the French Revolution and Napoleon. Hi there. What's going on now is Andrea, our writing fellow, here to my right, is receiving papers. Now what I think you've done is submitted a copy for her and a copy for me. And we will spend the next 2 weeks going over them. These are rough drafts. And we will go over them and put our various comments on them. They will be turned back to you that first Wednesday after the break, which is what, I think the 30th? Yeah, the 30th. That would be right. The 30th of March. And then you can work on them to, given our comments, to produce a finished version. That's in my sense of things what's going on today. Okay. And then when you turn in the finished version, whenever that is, and the syllabus will instruct you on that, when you turn in the finished version, then take Andrea's comments and my comments and the finished version and staple them all together when you turn in the finished version. Okay? All right. So Rihanna, seeing you, I realize I sent you by mail one of those evaluation sheets, but here's the actual hard copy.
Thank you so much.
You bet. You bet. And I think everybody else has back their hard copy from that particular assignment? I hope so. Okay. Okay. Well, I do not mean to hold you an entire session today. This is labeled on the syllabus as a general discussion. I have some points that I want to raise for general discussion. Hi there. So I want to keep you for maybe about half of the time. We're here at the end of the first half of the semester. I gave you no particular reading assignment for today. That is, but you'll see that what I did instead was load up for the remainder of the semester. So you can hardly simply go on vacation from the reading for this course. But anyway, I want to try to take a step back today, for all of us, to take a step back and take stock of this subject, French Revolution and Napoleon. By now we have the entire narrative in view. We've stitched it together from various readings, but we have the entire period of 1789 to 1815 in view. From Timothy Tackett, we actually had an idea of the years leading up to the revolution because he was concerned to explain the cause or the causes, the origins of the French Revolution. We went there and through the period of the assemblies, first National Assembly, then Legislative Assembly. Of course, the National Assembly was the one that wrestled with the issue of monarchy and produced the Constitution of 1791, which established a constitutional monarchy. Then came the National Convention, the onset of war, the Reign of Terror, which grew out of the National Convention. That came to a close in the summer of 1794. The fall and execution, in fact, of the leader of the Jacobin faction in the National Convention, whose name was Maximilien Robespierre. Then the period of time that we know by its form of government, the 5-year period of the Directory, and then a resumption of monarchy, a resumption of autocracy, if you will, but this time the figure at the top was not called a monarch, was not called a king, but rather was called an emperor. That took some years to sort out. He began as first consul, and then he became consul for life. But the direction of this was quite clear, and that was that Napoleon Bonaparte was going to be the man at the head of government, and to look at it this way, the founder also of a dynasty. And that lasted until he had provoked too many people and spread his resources too thin in war, and he fell, of course, at the Battle of Waterloo, which was a signal for the restoration of the Bourbon monarchy. What strikes me about all of this is that this was a period of immense dynamism, of an extraordinary intensity, acceleration, if you will, of action. A period of intense change, but also of the redirection of change, a recurrent redirection of change. Imagine yourself to be alive during this period of time, from 1789 to 1815 in France, and to accustom yourself to one phase of the revolution and think, at last, this is it. This is the point to which the revolution has been tending. This is the point of stasis. This is the point of stability. And what will ensue now is a slowing down of events. Events will slow down where they had seemed to be in the mode of such acceleration. There will be a consolidation of power, a consolidation of order under whichever government it was at the time in question. Your assumption is that the future would unfold in the same direction to which the changes that had produced where you are now had been tending. And then imagine the surprise and, depending on who you were, the horror at what happened next. Because then the revolution went on in a way that you had not foreseen. And the stability that you had depended upon, or at least reconciled yourself to, did not follow. It can seem as though the revolution represents a period of events in which one succeeded, the event that succeeded the last event left nothing in place. And yet what I want to suggest to you today is that although the revolution seems that way, although it seems as though it was a string of events that each turned the direction of action in a way that nothing fundamental could be said to have lasted from the last change or from the last changes, that in fact that's not the case, that plenty changed, that there was a basic development to all of this, no matter who was in power. And I thought that I would raise that question of the basic development of the French Revolution. That is, what changed at the most fundamental level with regard to 4 points. First, the whole issue of property rights as against care for the poor. A recurrent theme. Second, the issue of nobility versus bourgeoisie. A recurrent theme, particularly once Napoleon settled upon the policy of an amnesty for those who had left France, as long as they would return and agree to serve him. They could return. Third, the issue of monarchy or empire on the one hand, as opposed to republic and democracy on the other hand. And fourth, the issue of rights versus order. And it may be as we start to talk about these that what we say about the first few points will satisfy the question of the latter two. But I thought we could plunge in and at least use these as prods to discussion. You'll notice that I have said here nothing about two other features of society, one gender, the other race or slavery. And I've deliberately not included them because our discussion about either of those is going to be so enriched by the works that are on the syllabus for the second part of the course. The book by Susan Buck Morse about Haiti and the slave rebellion there. And then the book by Suzanne Dessanne about the way in which the revolution through its laws changed the basic legal parameters of the family. But let's begin with the first issue, property rights versus care for the poor. What does that suggest to anyone? What does that suggest to anyone? Property rights for whom? And in what way did the issue of care for the poor present itself? At what time? Who were the advocates? Care for the poor. First place, why worry about the poor? They are always with us, says the Bible in a famous, and I would say out of character, spot. But they, of course, were always with the French. Look at the price of bread. Look at the factors that we've identified that increase the price of bread. I told you about that old study by the economic historian Larousse, who said that the price for bread reached its apex throughout the entire 18th century in July of 1789, which can lead us to think our own thoughts about the crowd that assembled in front of the Bastille on the 14th of that month. So there was a lot of hunger, to use that as an indication of poverty. So who then steps forth as the advocate that something should be done about that, something in excess of the charity that had been performed, let us say, by the church in the old regime? I mean, who thought that this was a crisis of poverty that called for action? Yes?
Planks of the Jacobin.
All right. Very good, very good. The Jacobins did that, and that's one way to begin to talk about this embrace between the Jacobins and the sans-culottes, the urban masses in Paris. Now, we've spoken about that embrace as a kind of incitement to violence. We've spoken about that to some extent Robespierre and his colleagues received the impulse to deal with their enemies violently through this alliance with the popular mass. Yes?
I think when you get on later on, when you're dealing with Napoleon stuff, when you look back on stuff, have the professional soldiers.
He doesn't have what?
Napoleon,
Yeah.
when he looks back on the riots of 1789 and 4, that are his soldiers now. They are the poor. They are the conscripts, the levy. Like, I mean, at least Louis could look and oh, I have professional soldiers. I'm paying them. They'll be loyal.
Yeah.
He knows if there's another riot, these are the poor. My levies are the army. I can't
Okay.
afford to let the poor revolt.
Okay. I mean, as the army enlarges, and Brian's point is well taken, this becomes an institution that the government has a vested interest in feeding. Because, you know, with regard to the French Revolution, I mean, you saw what happens when French soldiers changed their minds about whom to support in the middle of a riot. Yes, Joe.
This is really the root and cause of a lot of the revolutions of history, though, isn't it? Where the power and position of the noble class or the aristocracy or whatever you want to call it is
Let's get
usurped
that
by the
mic closer to
masses.
you, by the way. Yeah?
Well, they don't want to hear me.
Oh, but they do. You have a following.
But it's usurped by the disgruntled masses.
Yeah.
Who are,
Well, you're right. Most of them came to nothing other than bloody suppression. This one continued long enough for government to raise the question what to do about poverty under the pressure of these people out of doors. Yeah. Go ahead, Justin.
So, I guess now that he brought that up, I wish I would have wrote about it in my paper, but do you think that the levy en masse would have been like it'd also have been used to kind of get the poor into the army, not only for the manpower, but also
Yeah.
to kind of suppress possible riots, like, because it was in some ways better than how they were living. Like, Napoleon
Yes.
took care of his soldiers.
Yeah,
pretty
Napoleon
well.
took care of his soldiers.
So do you think it was also a political kind of...
To diffuse them.
Yeah.
I know there are certainly historians who argue that about military forces at the outset of the First World War. I've not seen that argued, but it's hard to imagine that were not the case. That's a very good point from both of you. Yeah.
And actually, to tag on to Austin's point, actually, is the book talks about total war and
Total
the fact
war.
that they were mobilizing more than just soldiers, but
Yeah.
giving the people a task, you know, in terms of producing arms and
Yeah.
you know, it gave them more to do and
Okay.
be able to earn more. I mean, so total war affected not just soldiers but citizens
Okay.
as well.
And that depends on the ability to bring that off depends upon booty. After a certain point, there has
Right.
the spoils of war have to be in somehow
Self-sustained.
directed to the war effort, and they were. Yes.
And one thing I actually wrote about was like Napoleon had the conscription, so like a draft, and if the rich people got drafted, they could pay the poor people to take their place.
Yes, they could.
So I mean, the army was mostly poor people because I mean the only way they could make money really
Yeah.
was to be drafted, kind of.
Yeah, yeah.
So I mean that's one thing I wrote about.
That's a good point. That's a good point. It could be claimed as part of after the Jacobins, as a shift away from a democratic aspect, or at least a democratic policy. The only thing is that policy was also in place when the Jacobins were in power. That it was a kind of constant that a man of means could buy his way out of military service. Having entered military service, the poor man had a claim upon the state to supply the basic needs of life. And as long as the army kept winning, which it did for a few decades, then those claims would be met. Yes, Victor.
I just noticed in an article that Napoleon would remark that every individual soldier would have a marshal's baton in his knapsack
Yeah.
because of the upward mobility.
Yeah.
It was so successful, which is the rest of the army.
Yeah, I mean, it certainly instilled that value in the soldiers, this idea that they were part of an institution where talent would rise to the top, service would be given its due reward. Now, question. I mean, this is, I think, a very fruitful direction in which to take the question. But there remained poor in France, And the policies that had been introduced by the Jacobins, or at least foreseen by the Jacobins, to deal with the disadvantage of poverty, those policies were abandoned in 1794. I mean, the idea of revolutionary armies that would scour about the basin of Paris and confiscate grain to sell on the market at fixed prices, the maximum general of 1793, 1794, the maximum general was abolished. Ideas of generous pensions for widows and for orphans, and well, what we would call ideas that anticipate the social welfare state. Those ideas associated with the Jacobins were cast aside when the Jacobins fell. And how does that fit into a discussion of, and again I put the question, property rights versus care of the poor? Yes?
I hate to say it, but there's always a political party who's looking for the support of one strata of society or another, and they will buy it however they need to.
Okay. And are you implying that the stratum of society changed when the Jacobins fell? The Jacobins were the...
No,
huh?
the new power drew their support from another class.
Yeah, okay, yeah, that's what I meant with my perhaps poorly worded question. The new power drew its support from another class. And how would you characterize that class? What class was it? Pardon?
Is it the bourgeoisie?
Okay, the bourgeoisie. The bourgeoisie. In terms of the history of the revolution, in a certain way, we go back to 1791, don't we? Remember the whole debate about the active citizen versus the passive citizen? The active citizen is the male in possession of the entire catalog of rights. The passive citizen is the male in possession of every right but one. And that is the right to vote, right? That a requisite amount of taxation was not paid to establish that male, that man, had a stake in society, and that said they could not vote. I mean, the Jacobins passed a democratic constitution, basically one man, one vote. Of course, they never held an election. Well, why would we let that ruin their reputation? Okay, I mean, that gets into the whole debate about what the Jacobins did and why and what they were up to. But, I mean, should we just leave it and say that war put the question on a new basis because it created a mass army and fed it. And that's a new dimension that no one had foreseen in 1789 or 1791. As far as efforts to help the civilian poor, well, they were curtailed. They were curtailed. Can you look back on the book by Peter McPhee and talk about, well, I mean, he carries the narrative, you remember, up to 1799, so we get past the Jacobin phase. And do you remember his analysis of this question, which affects the rural poor? And given the population of France, the rural poor were the majority of the poor. Right? A nation, 85% or so peasant. Do you remember anything he talks about with regard to, let's say, sale of the land or use of the land? I mean, he says this is a huge issue that historians who've been so riveted on the city have overlooked. An issue that affected village after village after village. Yeah?
Wasn't it a debate like if common lands should continue to be common lands, if they could be bought?
Yeah.
If like they should be parceled off? Wasn't that
Yeah,
a debate?
exactly. And if you're a poor peasant, I'll give you three options. One is common land is sold to the highest bidder. The second is common land is put in parcels, as you just suggested, and moreover, the government creates possibilities of loans for a poor bidder. And the third is that common lands whose use had been perhaps subject to doubt is simply opened to the community to use. I mean, which do you like best, which do you like second best, and which do you like third best?
You like the open land the best because you don't have much money.
Okay.
The parcel probably second. I mean, those are probably interchangeable, to be honest, because, I mean, if you have a small parcel of land, you like to think that you could eventually pay off the loan.
Okay.
I'd say those are probably interchangeable.
Okay,
Obviously,
all right.
the highest bidder.
So that's 1 and 2.
Yeah.
And 3 would be the highest bidder. And I mean, the Jacobins had plans to shift the emphasis of policy to the poor peasant. Like, I mean, the Jacobins were not in power for that to be anything but dead letter. But of course, I mean, the Jacobins were aware also of using policy to create a constituency. I mean, they defended Catholic opinion, but they could, you know, try to restore opinion among Catholic peasants by other means. But of course, the Jacobins fell after only months with this policy. Yes?
I was going to ask, how much of that common land at this point had prior to the revolution been church land?
That's a large percentage. And another percent, I can't give you a percentage, but an exact percentage, but your question makes me wish I knew another percentage, and that is how much of the church lands that had begun to be sold in 1791, proceeds of which undergirded the new currency, how much of that land had already been sold in 1791 and remained there with peasant eyes upon it in 1793, 1794, when the Jacobins were talking about these schemes to, you know, low interest loans and things. And I don't know the answer to that. I mean, my impression is that by 1794, the lands in question, except for common lands, traditionally common lands, the lands in question were lands that had been seized because emigres had moved, emigres that had left France. Those estates came, you know, open onto the market, and also royal lands, royal forests, for example, forest lands. But I'm not sure. There may still have been church lands in 1794. And if they were, hard to imagine they weren't put on the market, given the general idea of policy. Yes?
Well, so many peasants had subsistence living on these common ground, not only gathering firewood, but their daily vegetables and wild wheat and everything else. So
yes.
Once you deprive them of that access, they starve.
Yeah, yeah. So really for them, they want access. If they're going to parcel it out, then parcel it out. But worst is to create it as someone's property. But of course, the revolution drifted toward property and the valuation of property, the rights of property as opposed to the rights of the poor. This is not a course in French history in the 19th century, or not a course in French history from 1789 until 2016. But what would happen through generations of poor, let's say generations of poor peasantry, to have had a period in time where an activist government attempted what can only be called a redistribution of wealth. Not an equalization of wealth, that overstates the point, but a redistribution of wealth that is then largely abandoned when that government fell from power, which the Jacobins did in 1794. I mean, if you were to turn yourself now into an historian of rural France in the 19th century, and that were the question, what would you imagine? What would you suppose? Joe?
I still think the impetus for a lot of that was the king calling for the carrier.
Yeah.
I don't know if I'm saying it right.
Yeah, yeah.
But
As well as I can say. Well, we've got our expert here. Yeah, there we go. He was close enough, right? B plus, A minus.
he talked about it quite a lot, but once that barn door was opened and everybody thought, you know, all my grievances are going to be settled with the nobility, that really made the revolution possible.
You're right. The king created a focus that he had not intended. Good point, yeah.
It started with the nobles collected too much land, and since they didn't pay tax on the land,
Yeah.
the nation went broke. Because
Yeah.
every bit of land they collected was another piece of land that didn't get taxed.
Hmm.
The more land they had, the less got taxed.
A counterfactual. Louis does not act. He lets the problem drift, which would have been in keeping with tradition. Then what? Then what? I mean, that would be a question. Since, I mean, you look at the revolution, you see these big, these big causes pushing it forward, in the early years. Noble tax exemption, monarchical bankruptcy. But ask yourself this: suppose Louis had been presented with the idea to call the Estates-General and demand all these cahiers, which you're talking about, and in this way solicit opinion about the noble class. And imagine if he said, "No, I don't want to do that. What a crazy idea! Solicit popular opinion. Why would I want to do that? We'll get through. We always have." Then what happens? Yes.
You still have the discontent of the bad harvests and the bad weather and the absolute shortage of food. I mean, people were fighting for survival.
Right. Well, food riots were common to the old regime and had been common in the years leading up to 1789, but they never had a political focus given to them. Yes?
I think if Louis had the know-how to figure it out earlier, he would never have had the country go bankrupt in the first place.
All right.
By spending money on war. So I think it's almost an impossible question to ask, because part of the reason they went bankrupt was because of their poor decisions.
Okay.
So, it's possible he could have flipped a switch and started making good decisions, but I think the dominoes were already falling, or he couldn't stop them at that point.
Would it have been a good decision to say, "I will not convene the Estates-General"?
I think it was inevitable at some point. I think France would have gone bankrupt, or
Right.
It eventually had to happen. I think it would have been a good decision to say, "No, we won't help you out, America, with the Revolutionary War." But for the goodness of France.
Mm-hmm.
He called that in response to the financial crisis, right?
Yes.
He was looking for a way to solve it.
Right.
And if I recall previous lectures, he was hoping the Estates-General would give him the authority to tax the nobility.
And that would be the end of it.
But all of the profligation of pamphlets and whatnot
Yes.
drew popular support behind the Third Estate.
Right. That he thought of as a minor player in all of this, because by tradition it had been. That's a good point. So a miscalculation at the top. In a way, counterfactuals irritate most people, but because they can tend to be something like a parlor game. But the counterfactual may understate the pressure that Louis XVI found himself under. And so he called upon the Estates-General, thinking that it would, stay in bounds, customary bounds, which it did not stay in. So, this first point, my reason to raise this first point was really to try to identify one common theme at the foundation of the French Revolution that runs like a line through from 1789 to 1815. What to do about the poor. The comments that you've been making about the way in which war set that issue in a new light and put it on a new footing, those are well-taken comments. Of course, civilian poor remained. And in the interest of the rights of property, the governments that followed upon the National Convention, just undertook to do less than the Jacobins had ever imagined that they would do. Okay, what about the issue of nobility versus bourgeoisie? What about the issue of nobility and bourgeoisie? That became the issue between the Third Estate and the first two, once the Estates-General had been called. What about that issue? How did that sort itself out, 1789 to 1815? Yes?
I've thought about it, and when they officially, I guess more or less banned nobility and got rid of it,
Yeah.
that almost seemed like something that had already happened but wasn't necessarily set in stone. Because when you give
Okay.
power to anybody, they're going to take advantage of that power. And when you give power to people who are angry at the nobility and hungry because, food rations and stuff, that's bad. I mean,
Yeah. Those may be overlapping groups, but they're not the same group.
yeah.
Okay.
But I think that the moment that you got the third estate in with the clergy and the nobility at that moment meant significantly less than it had the day before.
Okay. Okay.
And
Yes.
I think
Okay.
just the fact that the Estates-General occurred gave nobility just no chance of survival.
Okay. But that sounds like a judgment on a development that had been going on in the long term. That is, for many years, the third estate, which means here the bourgeoisie, because the bourgeois deputies were the ones that dominated the third estate. The bourgeoisie had tired of this kind of dominance that was simply set aside for the nobility. Yes, there were possibilities through generation after generation to buy your way into the nobility, but one could begin to imagine a society in which that weight no longer rested upon society. Yes?
I think what really broke the nobility's back was the doubling of the third estate.
Yeah.
Because at first they were all pretty even, the first two outnumbered
Right.
the third, and then for some ungodly reason he doubled the third.
Right.
Because they wanted it and he just gave it to them, and that gave them a majority.
Right. But remember, the second concession had to be made as well, and that is double the third and vote as one body, not as three. And that was the killer for the nobility. I mean, he was willing to double, to quadruple, to 10 times, 40 times. All of France can be a member of the third estate. But he did not want to make that last concession.
How did that last concession come in?
They left.
Oh, God, right?
And insisted. Your hand had been up, and then Victor, and then Joe.
It seems like the nobility had to kind of restructure itself. It couldn't lay its claims on
Yeah.
like royalty or royal blood or something like that.
Or noble blood.
Noble blood in that.
Yeah.
Yeah,
Mhm.
yeah. And
Mhm.
so they had to kind of restructure, and they still were the wealthiest citizens,
Yeah,
generally
among
speaking,
them, yes.
amongst,
Mhm.
And so it became like a new understanding of how they interacted in society. And of course, you had the immigrators that went outside of France, and then you had the nobility that stayed and supported, like Lafayette and some others for a while.
Yeah.
That stayed and supported the revolution.
Yeah.
And so, I mean, they really kind of are tossed to the side and just kind of incorporated into this mix. Even though they were still there,
Mhm.
they lost a lot of their power
Yes.
outside of wealth.
That's true. I mean, they lost, yeah, and those who left, of course, could insist that the old form of nobility still existed and that one day they would come back and reclaim it. What happened when Napoleon made his arrangement that you can come back, but only on terms of service?
That opened a whole new question. They actually opened a door for nobility to fit itself into
Yeah.
French society again.
Okay.
And
And it's this
but in
new
a different
basis
way.
that you were talking
It
in a different
wasn't-
way.
It wasn't in the way that they were originally,
Right.
held.
Right, right. I mean, whether your family had been noble for 3 centuries or 4 centuries or 5 centuries did not matter. What role do you play in Napoleonic France? And in that, you're aligned. You sit alongside, the sons of innkeepers and scribes and ordinary people. In effect, the career open to talent was extended to noble as well. Who is it? I think Victor.
Vacuums of power that were occupied by the nobility were being now occupied by these second-level bureaucrats of the bourgeoisie. So there's new people assuming the same positions in localities.
Okay, so a hierarchy remains, but the composition of it, as between noble and bourgeois, changes. Okay, Joe, here.
That was more or less the point I was going to make. I don't know what percentage of the nobility actually left. When they vacated, their positions were taken over by the bourgeois, and that really tips the balance of power,
Right.
especially if it was a significant number who left.
It was a significant number of who left, absolutely. And the bourgeoisie are in power, and they may be the basis of the the National Assembly or the Legislative Assembly, but by 1800, they're the basis of the consulate. And by 1804, they're the basis of the empire.
But it even included judges and so forth.
Right. Yeah, yeah. I mean, the sovereign courts of the monarchy had been abolished in favor of new courts, where educated jurists, using the power of education, sat. And why would Napoleon remove them and put in people whose only claim was really the blood? Yeah. So, yes?
I have a question. I was actually kind of thinking about the statement I just said, but the nobles, with regards to wealth and land, they were wealthy because of land, but they were also wealthy for other reasons, I'm sure.
Mm-hmm.
When land became available for private ownership, were the nobles able to buy back their own land, or did they have to buy their own land? Do they have right to the land they had previously sat on?
That's a good question. I would say they had no claim on the original land. It had been sold. And part of the deal with Napoleon was, no, property has changed hands, and that means it's changed hands. The civil code enshrines the right of property. No claim to prior ownership contravenes that. So let's say a noble family that stays in France, there were such, and land comes on the market, can they as purchasers purchase it? I would say, I mean, I'd have to be given counter evidence, but I would say yes. That this is now a society about money, and their money is as good as anyone else's. I think that's the way to look at it. And I mean, your author points out, that is, which author? Rapport, excuse me, points out that let's take the high generalships in the army. He points out that a majority of those, as opposed to 1789, were now in bourgeois hands. But I draw the correlation that a minority of them were now in noble hands, and presumably from families that had some wealth, although the case of Napoleon illustrates that someone could be from the lesser nobility and still be nobility. And those families stayed, and it seems to me they had every right on the market that anyone else had on the market. There would be no basis to challenge them. Okay. So in the same way that there's a drift in this society toward the rights of property as opposed to this Jacobin concern for the poor, in the period 1789 to 1815, there's a drift toward a society in the image of the bourgeoisie. Wealth and education count. The nobility can re-enter if it ever left. In any case, the nobility has to play in accordance with those rules. It has no advantage, no set-aside based upon family lineage. And when we talk about the revolution in this way, when we take our minds off the surface agitation of government, and surface agitation may seem to you like too weak a metaphor, maybe the tsunami of government, the hurricane, the storm of the century going on up there, it does seem as though certain basic changes are being wrought at the fundament of society. And what France received from all of this was a real change in 1815 from a society that had existed before 1789. Now another question. What has happened in this whole issue of the monarchy, the monarchy, the monarchy? We saw with what tenaciousness in particular the Legislative Assembly clung to the Legislative Assembly, I would say, clung to the idea of a monarchy because they had every reason to want to cast aside Louis XVI. When I say that, what had Louis XVI done to put a doubt on his worthiness to serve as constitutional monarch? What's that referred to?
Skip town.
All right, he tried to leave. Treachery, treason. And yet still, and you can find the, the great lights of 1792, 1793, 1794. Back in 1791, you can see them. Brissot, Robespierre, Brissot actually had a moment of doubt. But they're all in line behind the idea of a constitutional monarchy, as though none of them could conceive of what lay ahead, which was, of course, a republic. Well, how do you interpret the next 20 years? I guess that gets us up to what, 1811, so right in the middle of the empire. How do you interpret what happened? The republic had such a short life. Yes,
Well,
Joe and then Ryan.
I just want to back up just a bit. There were, I assume, more people than just Rouault who had the fear of what would happen if the monarchy was completely decapitated.
Yes.
I mean, that he provided a certain amount of stability,
Yeah.
whether it was a pure monarchy or a constitutional monarchy. And I don't think anybody, I don't say anybody, but there was probably a fair chunk of French society that didn't want to go there.
With the abolition of the monarchy.
Yes.
Right. I agree with you. I agree with you that the horror, and yet, those of you, I can't, which did you mention, Rouault?
Yeah.
Okay, he was the one you wrote about? All right. I mean, some of the ones you wrote about made their peace with the idea of regicide, and some of them felt some horror. Ryan and then Brian.
I think what happened was, the idea of a republic was pretty cool for 2 years until they started chopping off everyone's head.
Yeah.
And then they're like, this didn't happen under the monarchy.
Okay.
And then the emergence of Napoleon, who was a strong
Okay.
leader.
Only one word to put a little doubt in this. Directory. From 1795 to 1799, that was the government. An extraordinary array of characters were in the government, from, Jacobins from the Committee of Public Safety to monarchists from before, and they all served a republic. That is, the republic lasted for, 9 years, not just 2. And what does that say? I mean, I put it to you, historians, I think, often hit questions. I don't know the answer offhand why in 1795 they maintained a republic that had been tainted for many people by the Jacobins. Why hold on? It creates a crazy picture.
Possible because there wasn't a true leader that they felt confidence in, and they felt the republic was the best option because they didn't want to put all the power into one man that was currently there. But once Napoleon showed up, they felt comfortable putting all the power into him.
What if I asked you to reverse cause and effect? What if by 1799 they were looking for a strong leader and Napoleon occurred to them, but that there was nothing, there was no L branded on for leader branded onto his forehead, that he was a man made by a demand for him? I put that question to you. Brian, your hand.
That is my argument. It seems like people wanted a monarchy. You take communism, there's always one person who rises to the top. During the Republic, Robespierre, he kind of took over the leadership. People always want one person. The Republic, people didn't look for, okay, who's going to speak now? It seemed like it was always Robespierre stepping forward to take the lead. Communism, we've got one leader steps forward. We've got a we've got a constitutional republic, but we have one leader we kind of look forward to all the time. You don't say, oh, Congress is going to do this. Who's president? People have a tendency to, who's in charge? You walk into an organization, you walk into a club, you walk into anything, who's in charge? Heck, aliens come down, take me to your leader, not take me to your democratically elected Congress.
Oh, well, if aliens say, take me to your leader, I guess that settles the matter.
It's always who's in charge.
Yeah.
You walk into a company, hey, who's in charge here? Who's the main person?
We need a king because aliens are coming.
Yeah, we won't have anybody to supply. Go ahead,
By the
Victor.
time Napoleon arrived, all the organizational benefits of the Republic had already been in the departments, and so had already been taking shape. So that he just provided an additional stability to what had already been happening through the instigation of the Republic.
Well, he did, although the men who named him first consul in 1799 were no doubt thinking their thoughts about that stability in 1802 when he named himself consul for life, or in 1804 when he had himself crowned emperor. And that was not what they foresaw. And they thought of him as a figurehead. Dune.
What if Napoleon put this image out about himself, which made people think there was a need for it?
You know, it's an interesting question. It sounds like I have more questions than answers today. But when did Napoleon begin to conceive himself as a governmental as opposed to military leader? I mean, he certainly put out an image of himself as a great general. It's like those of you who've taken courses with me about the Third Reich know that that's the question with Adolf Hitler. When did Hitler begin to think of himself?
Well, I think he always wanted to be the best of the best.
Yeah.
So I think, I mean, since probably he was born, he always saw, like, the highest he could go was the top of France.
Not when he was born.
Well, I mean,
There was a monarchy. He was a minor nobleman. There was no power vacuum for him to enter. Pardon?
probably, like, since the revolution started, I think he saw an opportunity. I mean, I don't have any evidence to back it up.
Yeah, it's a good question. I mean,
where he could rise to the top of France, because I think he was a natural-born leader.
yeah, I mean, 1797 may have been a turning point when he really was the master of Italy at the Treaty of Campo Formio. I don't know whether, I mean, when did the idea first occur to anyone, him included, that he would be first consul in a post-Republican France? I have no idea. Yes?
Kind of stepping back real quick, but then I also want to address what just happened, what we just were talking about, is the directory. I think we're kind of looking at, okay, well, the people wanted a leader or something like that, but there also was a lot of, the directory itself wasn't able to stabilize. I mean, they had 5 directors, right? So they had some kind of sense of leadership. They did have somebody who was in charge.
Yes, they did.
And they did have a means of being able to look to that authority.
Yeah, yeah.
Regardless, I mean, it was split between 5 people, so it wasn't one person, but it was
Right.
still less than like the huge National Assembly or something like that.
Right, right.
But the directory had the most like support when Napoleon took Italy. Like I was reading, I don't know where I read that actually, but that during when he conquered Italy, the directory was a little bit more stable because they had military success. When the military, started failing, the support for the directory started failing.
Right, right.
And so they kind of looked to this military leader because of.
I mean, it is interesting that at the time they decided this, he was on a military adventure that has to be labeled truly bizarre.
Yeah.
Because he had set out for Egypt.
Right.
So, but he certainly had the reputation as the leading general at that time.
He's definitely
one thing, what impelled the directory to think that it was an incapable, or members of the directory to think that it was incapable of strong leadership, and that is they were forever having to invalidate elections, because even in the limited franchise of the directory, sometimes the royalists would win, and that boded ill, and sometimes the Jacobins would win, and that boded ill. They would have to uncover plots and put down demonstrations and void the result of elections. So it seemed like that it sort of lurched from crisis to crisis, and even military victory, which Napoleon had supplied and others had supplied, even military victory did not seem to some of this leadership to be sufficient. Whose hand was it? Yeah, Victor.
I think it was a vital point that Napoleon was a rebel, and I believe he so.
But so far down, hard to even see him down there.
Yeah, I understand. But he considered himself pretty special. Whatever
Well, he
was
did.
lacking in ego of others was not lacking with Napoleon whatsoever.
Right.
He thought himself pretty darn
Right. I mean, but the question is, when did his egomania shift onto the track of governmental power? That's the question. I don't know the answer to it. But I do know that in 1799, it would be a mistake to see him as anything other than a made man. The directors made him. Yes.
That's a singular leader is always able to be more decisive and more responsive, even than a committee of 5. And when things were going to hell in a handbasket, for lack of a better phrase, one of the threats was the counter-revolutionary nobility. And I got the impression from rapport that the directory asked Napoleon and the military to come in and provide stability because they wanted somebody to fill that vacuum before the nobility did. And that's kind of how I read it.
Okay, but remember how we're talking about years that the imperialism of the directory had really lurched from victory to victory. The Austrian Netherlands, well, it was now a French province. The the Netherlands, the United Provinces, it was now a sister republic, the Batavian Republic. Switzerland, ditto, a sister republic. In Italy, all the way down the Cisalpine Republic. Now that may not seem like much in terms of the empire that was coming, but to the people who were there in 1789, 1798, 1799 could say that France since 1789 has never been more secure. Never been more secure. That nobles, émigrés, the counter-revolution has never been more on the defensive. Because, I mean, where the noblemen had been operating was now French territory. And that's quite a mark of success. The worst of the counter-revolution in France had put down. They had managed to put down royalist and Jacobin revolts in the meantime. But I mean, you know, let's just agree that some directors decided that this move was necessary, and some directors decided that Napoleon was the way to do this, and that everything that everyone has said about his prestige and his honor and so forth, that worked to his advantage. That's what suggested him to them, as opposed to any other step that may have been under consideration. Now my question is, why did France at large, and this has to do more with what had emerged as the political class, for want of a different term, why did France stand back as Napoleon recreated monarchy, although they called it an empire? Yes?
Do you think it was fear and trust? I mean, I think they were afraid of Napoleon because, like, the mystique or the heroic, like, myth he made himself to be. I think if anyone opposed him, I think they were afraid of what could happen to them. It's like lack of popular opinion. Like, the reason the National Assembly was so successful was because all these people were before them, and they had, like, I mean, how many was it? 600 people.
Mm-hmm.
I mean, it's like a huge crowd. It's hard to pick out one person out of 600, but if one person goes and opposes Napoleon, who's to say everyone will back him?
Okay. All right. Napoleon had really, what Napoleon did was consolidate his hold, and rivals, it discouraged rivals, yes.
Napoleon's army was loyal to him.
Okay.
Like the other ones during the middle of the war where they, okay, if you don't do this, I'm going to turn my arm on you, and the army says, we're not following you. Napoleon's army followed him, not the nation.
Okay. All right. The army had become the indispensable base of power, and that created the opening for Napoleon to do in France as he would. Yes?
But just going to make a comparison on that exact thing. That's how Caesar wound up.
Mm-hmm.
That was my point.
Okay.
Sorry, go ahead and
You took his point. All right.
He stepped into a vacuum.
Yeah. Okay.
You made the point last week that he was a opportunist.
He was an opportunist, right. And since he's an opportunist, to think of him as having a long-term plan that he nourished over years and that came into fulfillment in 1804 is probably to misconceive the issue, that he took things as they presented them to him. Was there a hand here? Yes. Cameron, I hadn't seen that.
remember you talking a lot about how before there was no going back
Yeah.
to monarchy because too much had changed.
Yeah.
Like, who were they going to get to replace Louis XVI after they killed him? And I think Napoleon just gave him someone that could conceivably run the nation.
Right. But it is interesting that he did so in the form of a monarchy. That is, in theory, he created a dynasty. He was royalty.
Yeah, but he was still a soldier of the revolution.
Okay. He definitely was a soldier of the revolution.
So while he did create a monarchy, people could conceivably support him while still giving credence to the revolution and not
Right.
completely going all the way back before
Yeah.
1789.
Let me ask you this. Napoleon is in power. You're a member of his government. July 14th comes around. You celebrate. What do you celebrate?
It's me now.
Huh?
Don't you celebrate the death of the Louis dynasty? Because, I mean, it's no longer blood.
Okay.
Napoleon came to power and he wasn't related to anybody.
Yeah.
I mean, he was low nobility, but he wasn't related to that whole empire.
Right.
He came to power through brute strength, not through blood. I think that's what you celebrate.
Okay. Yes.
I think there's a difference between the old regime and Napoleon's version of monarchy. He doesn't put into place everything that Louis XVI had stood for. So all the changes that occurred during the revolution were still effectively in place,
Yes.
accepting that there's a new leader. And I mean, he had his own, the Napoleonic codes, they were very different than the old regime. So it's
They
not
were.
like nothing had happened.
I mean, that's a good point. And you, in that spirit, it seems to me, you celebrate your Bastille Day in 1804 or 1806 or 1808. It's not like nothing has happened. The nobility no longer has the dominance that it did. There's no longer this monopoly of land that there was. And if you identify with the fall of the nobility, you celebrate. If you identify with the change of land ownership, you celebrate. If you identify with the nation at arms, if you celebrate their victories, you use the 14th of July as yet another occasion to celebrate. No, the Jacobins had fallen from power. No, the sans-culottes were no longer the influential force that they had been 10 years before. But unless you were a partisan of all of that, then you accept what the revolution has brought you and you celebrate it. Yes?
And another thing that I read in the book that
Yeah.
Napoleon decidedly called himself the Emperor of the French.
The Emperor of the French.
Instead of the Emperor of France.
Right. And remember, he held these.
More with the people.
He held these referendums to secure his so to some extent, even popular sovereignty in this twisted, distorted form seemed to live on in Napoleon. Said, I'm the will of the French. I held a referendum. This is what they want. Fascinating, isn't it? Fascinating. Fascinating to think that sort of principles could seem so twisted, and yet people could celebrate their continuation nonetheless. Yes?
It seems like they went through all this trouble to get rid of the king, and then now they have Napoleon, who's sort of a monarch again.
Yeah. Yeah, it seems like a lot of effort to... And that's why I think this discussion today is so important, because it really does drive home the difference between the France of Louis XVI and the France of Napoleon. That underneath all kinds of changes had been wrought, and many people identified with them to some extent or another. This parcel of land that Ryan was talking about in former common lands, when we were speaking about that, well, if you bought that parcel of land somehow, if in your village you and others pooled your resources so 12 families could have 12 parcels of land, celebrate that parcel of land. Because without the revolution, it was inconceivable. So you celebrate, yes?
Relative to what she said about the Napoleonic Code, it sounded to me like one of the things that made him popular was that the judges in the communities, because of the Napoleonic Code, actually kind of worked for the people.
Okay, right. You continue, I mean, Napoleon, it kind of, the level of everyday life consolidated changes that the revolution had brought. Local justice, accessible justice, affordable justice. That had been that had been the importance of these justices of the peace that the revolution had created back in 1789. And Napoleon continued that. And so you say the soldier of the revolution, how about the guarantor of justice from the revolution? He can see in that light as well. And we aren't there yet, but wait till you open the book by Suzanne Desanne. I don't know if you have already on family courts. I mean, well, I mean, there, of course, we get into the entire question of the treatment of women under Napoleon, because Napoleon really was an utter reactionary with regard to the rights of women. But if some in France identified with that, and many did, you celebrate that. Your hand, and then I want to use that to a transition into something. Yes?
Can it be argued that Napoleon essentially was able to bring about what the revolutionaries essentially intended in terms of a constitutional monarchy and change in a lot of ways, social structure and changes in nobility and like legal code, like you were just talking
Right.
about. I mean, he kind of brought about what the revolution was originally intended to do.
Okay. Yeah, I mean, the men of 1789, the 600 or so, who broke away and constituted the assembly, minus the idea of constitution, which of course Napoleon did not recognize because he became an emperor, above law, above constitution. But minus that one issue, Napoleon supplied what they had imagined. It's the agitations in the meantime, the agitations to care for the poor, the agitations to establish democracy for ordinary people, the agitations for women's rights, the agitations to abolish slavery. It's there that it's that feature of the revolution. It's liberation of the disadvantaged, or I should say of the more disadvantaged. Because I agree the bourgeoisie had disadvantages in the old regime. It's the liberation of the even more disadvantaged that the revolution halted. That's what it halted. Now another question. Let's look at the revolution in one more light. Rights as against order. What rights can I have in mind? Yes. Okay, the right of voting. And that is completely twisted under Napoleon. It's reduced to this idea of referendum. I've just won you a great battle. Would you like me to be consul for life? I mean, what kind of, yes or no? Well, what kind of an election is that? Yes?
Property ownership.
Okay, property ownership. Property ownership. That's a right, and Napoleon strengthens it. What about the entire right of free speech, freedom to assemble, to petition government for the redress of grievances, freedom to take part in let's say, the life of political clubs, freedom of expression? What about all those freedoms? Yeah.
He made nice with the Catholic Church, too, didn't he?
He made nice with the Catholic Church. That was the sense of the Concordat of 1801. But again, not the old Catholic Church of the old regime, but the new Catholic Church whose priests were, in effect, public employees. That Catholic Church. Okay. I mean, the Catholic Church was, without enforcing, once again, a civil constitution of the clergy, which had been the issue back in 1790. He made the Catholic Church subservient to the state, although, albeit in doctrine, subservient to Rome, clearly. But when I went through this category, if we say rights of property, that can sound very solid for property owners. I don't have to worry about, peasants clamoring to parcel away my land. I keep my land. I don't have to worry about government seizing my grain and selling it at low prices to the urban poor. The right of property protects me from that. All right. But these other ones, free speech, freedom to assemble, that had been in such extraordinary display in 1791 on to 1794. What happened to all those rights? You don't like government? Print a pamphlet. Distribute it in 500 copies on the streets of Paris. Call the ruling class anything you like. I mean, that characterizes free speech, a lot of free speech during the early years of the Republic, and that's completely shut down. Censorship prohibits it. I mean, there's an extraordinary reduction of the number of outlets of public opinion. There are censors. There are police informants. Why did the French accept that? Yeah.
I mean, going back to Tackett, the production of pamphlets and these like strong opinions divided so much of France and created so much fear and rumor and insecurity. And so I think they were reluctant to return to that state of being, fear of counter-revolution.
Okay, so many in France, I mean, not the ones who have opinions that they wish they could express that way, but the others look at that as a time of instability. And division, as you point out. France is being forever divided. And what we need is a France unified. We need unity. We need unity under the emperor. And we need order. And if that means shutting down on people's rights to demonstrate, to petition, to express themselves, then so be it. So rights give way to order, too. And again, back to my question. Why would you celebrate on the 14th of July, 1789 in 1804 or 1806 or 1808? Well, you might celebrate the return of order as opposed to rights whose sheer rambunctiousness you want to suppress. Anyway. Well, I told you I would not keep you the whole time. You've been a patient group, listening to all the things I don't know. And it is the end of the first part of the term. I know you all have tickets to fly to Tahiti and that sort of thing. So on that note, I think I will do between Andrea and me. Does everyone have? Has everyone given us a paper? Okay. So.
Oh my gosh.
Yeah, well, you said in our house, everybody's allergies are already underway.
That's so funny.
Because of the springtime.
I haven't noticed it yet, though. And it's surprising.